She stood there, calm, her presence quiet yet impossible to ignore. The room was filled with people dressed in silk and diamonds, the kind of place where every glance was measured, and every whisper carried weight. In that world, where wealth defined status, the simple black woman was an easy target. She didn't walk with the arrogance of privilege, nor did she seek to impress anyone with material things. Her grace came from within, and that was exactly why she became the center of someone else's cruelty. The billionaire's wife had watched her from across the room, her eyes sharp, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. She didn't see a woman deserving of respect. She saw someone she believed was beneath her, someone whose quiet confidence threatened her need for attention. It wasn't enough that the room already revolved around her wealth and her last name. She wanted more. She wanted to humiliate. The moment built slowly, as if the air itself grew heavy with anticipation. The billionaire's wife lifted her crystal glass, swirling the deep red wine inside as though it were a weapon she had been waiting to use. Her laughter rang out first, sharp, cold, and designed to draw eyes. Heads turned, people paused, conversations cut short. Everyone sensed something was about to happen, and the wife made sure she had an audience. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each sound echoing like a countdown. The woman she targeted did not shrink away. She did not beg or try to disappear into the crowd. She simply stood still, shoulders squared, eyes steady, as though she had already endured 1,000 moments like this before. That quiet strength only fueled the billionaire's wife's cruelty. She needed a reaction. She needed to prove her power by making someone else small. And so, without hesitation, she tilted her hand and let the wine spill. The liquid poured across the woman's dress, soaking into the fabric, staining it with a dark, sticky red. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp intakes of breath that broke the silence all at once. Some mouths hung open in disbelief, others curled into nervous smiles, too afraid to show disapproval, too eager to stay aligned with wealth and influence. The billionaire's wife stood tall, her chin lifted, satisfied with the spectacle she had created. For her, this was victory, a display of dominance meant to remind everyone who held the power in the room. But beneath the surface of that calculated cruelty was something far more revealing. Her need to throw wine, to degrade another woman publicly, exposed the deep insecurity she carried. Her wealth could buy her the gown, the jewelry, the finest wine in her glass, but it could not give her the quiet strength that radiated from the woman she sought to humiliate. That strength did not come from money or status, but from resilience, from a life that had demanded perseverance in ways the billionaire's wife could never understand. The stains spread across the dress, yet the woman did not flinch. Her face did not crumble, her eyes did not fill with tears, her body did not bend to the cruelty meant to crush her spirit. She simply stood in that silence, her dignity intact, as though the wine was nothing more than a splash of water. And it was in that silence, that refusal to be broken, that the power of the moment shifted. The billionaire's wife thought she had humiliated her, but in reality, she revealed her own cruelty to everyone watching. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unwilling to confront the ugliness before them, while others stared with wide eyes, caught between shock and disbelief. The entire room now held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sound of the last drops of wine hitting the floor seemed louder than the music playing in the background. And in that suspended silence, it became clear that this was not simply an act of humiliation, it was a turning point, a moment that would ripple far beyond spilled wine and stained fabric. She stood in the center of the storm with a stillness that felt unshakable. The humiliation had been public, the wine poured with cruelty, but even then, her silence spoke louder than any words could. While the room watched with wide eyes, expecting her to crumble, to scream, or to retreat, she remained rooted in dignity. There was a strength in the way she carried herself, an invisible armor that no stain could pierce. People saw the soaked fabric, the red seeping into her dress, but what they missed at first glance was the unbroken spirit behind her eyes. That spirit told a story of battles already fought, of struggles endured long before she ever walked into that glittering room. Her silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't submission. It was power. In a world where everyone shouted to be heard, she spoke volumes without saying a word. Her calm became a mirror, reflecting the cruelty of the billionaire's wife back onto her. For all the wealth, the jewels, the fine clothes, it was the wife who suddenly looked small. The strength of the simple black woman revealed itself in how she refused to give her tormentor the satisfaction of a reaction. No tears fell, no anger escaped her lips. She chose to let her composure do the speaking, and in that choice, she commanded more respect than wealth ever could. There is something profound about a person who refuses to bend under the weight of humiliation. The billionaire's wife had expected her victim to break down, to provide a scene that would entertain the onlookers and affirm her superiority. But what unfolded instead was something entirely different. The woman's steady gaze, her unshaken posture, her refusal to crumble, these became a quiet act of defiance. She showed everyone present that dignity cannot be purchased, that self-respect cannot be stripped away by spilled wine or public mockery. Her strength came from more than just the moment. It was written in the way she held her head high, as though she had endured far worse and survived with her spirit intact. Life had likely tested her in countless ways before this night. She had probably walked through doors where people looked at her as though she didn't belong, where whispers trailed behind her, where her worth was measured by shallow standards. Yet each of those moments had only built her resilience, layer upon layer, until she could stand in a room dripping with wealth and cruelty and still not let it define her. That kind of strength doesn't appear overnight. It is forged in silence, in endurance, in a refusal to let the world dictate your value. The crowd that watched her began to shift in their perception. At first, they had looked at her as the target, the object of the wife's cruel game. But the longer she stood there, unbothered, unmoved, the more the power seemed to move toward her. What was meant to make her look weak only made her appear stronger. She turned humiliation into a stage for resilience, and in doing so, she unsettled everyone who believed money determined status. Her silence forced them to confront their own discomfort, their own complicity in standing by while cruelty unfolded before them. It is easy to see wealth and assume it brings strength, but here, in this moment, it was the woman without riches who embodied power. She showed that strength is not in loud declarations, nor in public displays of control, but in the ability to remain unshaken when the world tries to tear you down. Every second she stood still was a statement, one that said, "You cannot take away what I know about myself." Her strength did not come from her dress, her jewelry, or her position in that room. It came from something far deeper, something untouchable. Even as the stains spread across her clothes, even as whispers rose and fell around her, she refused to carry shame that wasn't hers to hold. Her composure became a shield, her silence a declaration that no act of cruelty would define her. The billionaire's wife had sought to reduce her, to strip her of dignity, but all she managed to do was reveal how little she understood the power of quiet resilience. In that room full of wealth and arrogance, it was the so-called simple black woman who carried herself like a queen, her dignity unshaken, her silence heavy with strength that no one could ignore. The arrogance of the billionaire's wife was not sudden, nor was it hidden. It was woven into every movement she made, every glance she cast, every word that left her lips. She had lived her life believing that money was the highest measure of worth, that her status placed her above reproach, above humility, above decency. In her world, power was not something earned through kindness or respect, it was something flaunted, displayed like jewelry, and used as a weapon against anyone she deemed beneath her. That arrogance walked with her into the room long before the wine spilled, filling the air with a sense of superiority that clung to her like perfume. She was the kind of woman who believed eyes should follow her everywhere she went, who measured her importance by the silence that fell when she entered. She did not see people as equals but as props, accessories to her own grandeur, tools to reflect her importance back to her. When she looked at the simple black woman, she did not see dignity or strength. She saw only an opportunity to assert her dominance, to entertain herself and her audience with a cruel performance. Arrogance blinded her to the possibility that anyone outside her circle of wealth could possess value worth recognizing. Every movement she made that night was deliberate. From the way she swirled her glass to the way she smiled when she noticed others watching, she played to the crowd as if the humiliation of another person were a show designed for their approval. The arrogance of entitlement lived in her posture, in the tilt of her chin, in the certainty that she could degrade someone without consequence. She had built her life on that belief, on the notion that money bought immunity, that her position as a billionaire's wife shielded her from accountability. It was not just cruelty that fueled her actions, it was the certainty that she was untouchable. That arrogance did not appear overnight. It had been nurtured, fed, and reinforced for years. People around her had laughed at her sharp words, excused her tantrums, admired her extravagance. She had been rewarded for every display of superiority, never challenged, never confronted. Power without humility had turned into entitlement, and entitlement had hardened into arrogance so thick she could not see beyond it. When she chose to throw the wine, it wasn't simply an act of spite, it was a declaration of her belief that she could do as she pleased, that others existed only to be reminded of her place above them. But arrogance is a fragile thing, built not on true strength but on illusion. The billionaire's wife wore it like a crown, but it was a crown made of glass, one that could shatter at the slightest blow. She needed constant validation to sustain it, which is why she sought an audience. Without the gasps, the whispers, the eyes on her, the act of throwing wine would have meant nothing. She needed people to see her power, to applaud her cruelty, to reinforce the narrative that she was above everyone else. Her arrogance demanded an audience because, deep down, it was hollow. The way she looked at the woman after the wine spilled revealed everything. Her eyes were not only filled with satisfaction but with the hunger for acknowledgement. She wanted to see fear, embarrassment, or anger reflected back at her. She wanted the woman to crumble so that she could feel validated in her superiority. Yet what stared back at her was calm, steady, unbroken, and it was in that moment her arrogance began to falter. For arrogance cannot survive in the face of quiet dignity. It thrives on reaction, on the visible wounds of others, but when met with silence, it begins to expose itself as weakness. Her entitlement had convinced her that humiliation was a form of power, but what she failed to recognize was how quickly arrogance can turn into isolation. As the guests shifted in discomfort, her performance no longer earned her admiration but unease. The same arrogance that had once commanded attention now began to erode the very foundation of respect she craved. In trying to strip someone else of dignity, she unknowingly revealed how little she possessed herself. The billionaire's wife believed her wealth made her untouchable, but her arrogance blinded her to the reality that power built on cruelty is the most fragile power of all. She lived in a world where no one had ever dared to challenge her, where she mistook silence for agreement, where she confused fear with respect. That night, her arrogance stood before everyone as naked as her cruelty, a mask slipping to reveal the insecurity it was always hiding underneath. The night did not end with the splash of wine or the sharp intake of gasps that followed. What lingered was the silence, the uneasy shifting of eyes, the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. What no one expected was how quickly the tide would turn, how swiftly the balance of power in that room would shift. Within hours, whispers began to spread, quiet at first, cautious, then louder, fueled by curiosity and disbelief. The arrogance of the billionaire's wife had been witnessed by too many, and though people hesitated to act in the moment, the consequences began to gather like a storm. What had seemed like an act of humiliation designed to strengthen her status instead set into motion a chain of events she could not control. The shocking twist came not from shouting or retaliation but from the way truth has a way of surfacing when least expected. The guests who had stood frozen began to recount what they saw. Some were appalled, others ashamed of their silence, and slowly the story left the walls of that glittering room. For years, the billionaire's wife had carried herself with entitlement, believing her wealth shielded her from scrutiny. But that night revealed something different. People began to see her not as a woman of grace or power but as a figure of cruelty. What was supposed to humiliate another only succeeded in exposing her. Behind the scenes, conversations unfolded. The staff, who had witnessed her treatment of others countless times before, now had a story too large to be ignored. Guests who had always smiled at her arrogance now felt compelled to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with her public cruelty. The quiet dignity of the woman she tried to demean became the focal point of every retelling. Each person who repeated the story emphasized the contrast, one woman clothed in jewels, dripping with arrogance, and another who stood in silence, unshaken even as wine stained her dress. The billionaire's wife had believed her actions would be forgotten as quickly as they happened, but arrogance blinds people to the way reputations unravel. Power built on perception is fragile, and in a single night, her carefully constructed image began to collapse. The shocking twist was not only that people began to question her character but that the consequences were immediate. In households of wealth and influence, image is currency, and hers had been shattered before an entire audience. What she thought was an act of dominance had become the very spark of her undoing. Within 24 hours, her world no longer looked the same. The whispers had reached places she could not control. The same society that had once embraced her extravagance now turned its back in quiet judgment. People who had once applauded her displays of wealth began to step away, unwilling to stand beside a woman whose cruelty had become the subject of every conversation. The story spread not as gossip but as truth, undeniable because so many had seen it unfold with their own eyes. Her arrogance had convinced her that no act, no matter how cruel, could touch her. But the shocking twist was that her wealth could not erase what happened, nor could it protect her from the consequences. The billionaire himself was forced to reckon with the reality of what had taken place. His name, his reputation, his empire now carried the weight of his wife's actions. What she had done in a moment of cruelty became a stain on more than just a dress, it was a stain on the legacy he had built, one that demanded action. The eviction was not the result of anger alone but of necessity. Appearances mattered in their world, and her arrogance had crossed a line that could not be concealed. The shocking twist was that the very house she had walked through with pride, the very walls she believed she owned, became the space she was forced to leave behind. Within hours of her performance, she found herself packing, her belongings no longer a symbol of her power but a reminder of how quickly it had crumbled. The twist was never in the wine itself but in the aftermath it created. A single cruel act, done for entertainment and validation, had unraveled the life she had built. The woman she tried to humiliate had not raised her voice, had not fought back, had not sought revenge. And yet, by the next day, it was the billionaire's wife who stood in silence, facing consequences she never imagined possible. Eviction is more than the act of leaving a place. It is the stripping away of security, the unraveling of pride, the collapse of a life built on appearances. For the billionaire's wife, the fall was unthinkable. She had always walked through her mansion as though the walls bowed to her presence, as though the chandeliers sparkled brighter because she commanded them to. Every corner of that home had been a reflection of her wealth and her dominance, a stage where she performed superiority for anyone who entered. To be told she no longer belonged within those walls was not just a punishment, it was a dismantling of everything she believed made her powerful. The eviction was swift, shocking, and merciless. Within hours of her cruel display, she went from a woman who mocked others to one who faced the humiliation of being forced out of the very place she thought she controlled. Staff who had once bowed their heads at her presence now stood as quiet witnesses to her downfall. They watched her gather belongings not with admiration, but with the kind of silence that accompanies justice finally taking its course. Her arrogance had filled the halls for years, and now those halls echoed with the sound of her footsteps leaving. There is a sharp contrast between the way she entered that room with wine in her hand and the way she exited her home the following day. One moment she believed herself untouchable, and the next she was reminded how fragile her foundation truly was. Eviction was not just about losing a roof over her head, it was about losing control. The mansion was more than walls and windows to her, it was a fortress she had hidden behind, a symbol she used to shield herself from accountability. Once she was removed from it, stripped of the image it projected, all that remained was a woman exposed, vulnerable, and diminished. The news of her eviction traveled quickly, and with it came whispers of disbelief that such a woman could fall so suddenly. But for those who had long endured her arrogance, it was less shocking and more inevitable. The eviction became a symbol, a warning that cruelty cannot be masked forever by wealth or status. It revealed how little her money could protect her when her actions came to light. What had once been a house filled with luxury now became the stage of her humiliation, its gates closing behind her as if erasing her reign completely. Every object she packed became a reminder of the impermanence of her power. Dresses sewn with gold thread, jewelry she once flashed proudly, even the very shoes she wore as she strutted through rooms, all of it seemed smaller, meaningless when stacked into boxes. The staff who once carried these treasures with care no longer looked at them with reverence. The items became symbols of arrogance, reminders of how quickly wealth loses its shine when tied to cruelty. The act of eviction also revealed the fragility of her relationships. The so-called friends who once dined with her, laughed at her jokes, and applauded her extravagance were nowhere to be found. Their absence spoke louder than any words could, showing that their loyalty had never been to her, only to the status she represented. Once stripped of her home and her power, she was left alone, abandoned by the same circle she thought adored her. Eviction showed her that wealth had only ever bought company, not true loyalty, and without the mansion, without the glittering displays, she was simply cast aside. In those hours of departure, the humiliation was not loud but heavy. The quiet dignity that the simple black woman displayed the night before now echoed as a contrast to the billionaire's wife's collapse. While one had been drenched in wine and stood unbroken, the other carried boxes out of a mansion she could no longer claim as her own. The eviction was the mirror of her arrogance, showing her that power built on cruelty is temporary, that a home is not defined by its size or wealth but by the integrity of the person who lives within it. Each step away from the mansion was a step away from the identity she had clung to for years. The gates that closed behind her did more than mark the end of her time there, they marked the unraveling of the illusion she had built. For all her arrogance, for all her pride, eviction reduced her to what she feared most, someone without power, without control, without the walls of wealth to protect her. It was the ultimate fall from grace, the kind of ending she never imagined when she raised her glass to spill wine on another. The lesson hidden within that night was not written in the spilled wine or the shocked gasps that followed, but in the contrast between two women standing before the world. On one side stood the billionaire's wife, armed with wealth, arrogance, and cruelty, believing those were the measures of power. On the other stood the so-called simple black woman, drenched in humiliation but carrying herself with a strength that no stain could erase. It was in this contrast that the truth revealed itself: power built on arrogance collapses, but resilience and humility endure. The night was meant to strip one woman of her dignity, but instead it exposed the fragility of another's pride. People in the room expected outrage, retaliation, or tears from the woman who had been humiliated, but they saw something else entirely. They saw composure that unsettled them, silence that spoke louder than shouting ever could. That silence was a lesson in itself, a reminder that dignity does not come from wealth or position but from within. In refusing to bend to cruelty, she revealed that the true measure of strength is not in what you own, but in what you refuse to let break you. The billionaire's wife wanted to show dominance, but all she managed to reveal was how little she understood about real power. Humility is often mistaken for weakness, yet in that moment it was humility that stood undefeated. The woman who was mocked did not lower herself to the same cruelty, did not allow bitterness to define her. Instead, she chose to let her silence, her stillness, her refusal to react carry the weight of her response. That choice became a lesson for everyone watching. It taught that humility is not submission, it is control, it is wisdom, it is knowing that one cruel act cannot determine your worth. In a room full of people chasing status, she reminded them that the strongest person is often the quietest one. Resilience also revealed itself as more than just survival. It was not only about standing tall after humiliation, but about transforming the moment into something greater. Her resilience turned an act of cruelty into a mirror for everyone watching, forcing them to confront their own discomfort and their own silence. In her strength, they saw their own weakness, their failure to speak, their willingness to watch cruelty unfold. Her resilience held up that mirror without a single word, and in doing so, it left an impression none of them could shake. The downfall of the billionaire's wife only reinforced the lesson further. She had built her life around wealth, convinced that arrogance was a shield, but arrogance without compassion is a weight that eventually drags a person down. The eviction that followed was not just a punishment but a revelation. It showed that cruelty is never without consequence, that no matter how untouchable someone believes themselves to be, their actions eventually return to face them. Her fall was a reminder that power without humility is hollow, and when it collapses, it does so completely. For those who witnessed the entire chain of events, the memory was not of wine spilling but of the way one woman stood unbroken while the other was undone by her own actions. That memory became the true lesson, a story retold not as gossip but as a caution. It warned against mistaking arrogance for strength, against confusing wealth with respect. It taught that the qualities which endure are not jewels or mansions, but dignity, humility, and resilience, qualities no one can strip away, no matter how cruel the attempt. The lesson reached beyond the walls of that room. It carried into the whispers that spread afterward, into the conversations that followed, into the reputations that shifted. People remembered not just what happened but how it happened, the wine, the arrogance, the silence, the eviction. They remembered the woman who stood tall, and they remembered the wife who fell. It became a story of contrast, one that revealed that humility and resilience are not only virtues but sources of unshakable power. It reminded everyone that cruelty is fleeting, but dignity lasts, that arrogance destroys, but resilience protects, that the simplest presence can overshadow the loudest display of wealth. The night taught that true strength does not come from humiliation or dominance, but from the quiet endurance of one's spirit. It showed that resilience can outlast arrogance, that humility can silence cruelty, and that the most underestimated person in the room can often be the one who leaves the deepest mark.